Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Loretta Sarah Todd. She is the founder and creative director of the IM4 Media Lab, an Indigenous XR lab offering the first ever Indigenous virtual production training program. She has made significant contributions to Indigenous storytelling, with over 100 projects to her name, including award-winning documentaries, digital media, and acclaimed series like Coyote Science and Monkey Beach. She has garnered over 20 awards and international recognition. She is a respected speaker and writer. She has presented at prestigious forums such as I'm going to try to say this, VIF Immersed, MoMA, and the UN. And her accolades include a Rockefeller Fellowship, a Sundance Scriptwriters Lab Honor, and the Mayor's Award for Media Arts. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, and I'm so honored that you would invite me and want to hear about some of the work that I'm doing and we're doing here on the West Coast in Canada. I really appreciate that, and yeah, I value our time together. So, hi, thank
Oh,
you.
I appreciate you for saying that. Yeah, I mean, you know, I it's been a very new revelation for me in my life now. We started this movie club and we've been spending time watching a movie every 3 weeks together and taking time to actually sit and reflect and speak on it. And I can't tell you how different my relationship with media and film has become through this process. And I think there is so much that we can learn not only about whatever the message is in the film, but in all the connections and the intricate details between the angles and what it kind of, speaks to larger themes happening in society that inspire the production of the movie. And I think it is a wonderful tool to be used in education and something that needs to be talked about a lot more. I think growing up, often movies were just seen as like a waste of time. Like, don't watch movies, and I think it is really unfortunate when I think that form of mindset is taken on towards film and media, where there is a huge landscape of knowledge that can kind of be acquired if watched in through that lens. So my first question for you is, how did you kind of get interested in this space and how did you find yourself working here?
Well, it's a long story. I mean, it wouldn't, I'm just typical kind of half-breed kid growing up in, Alberta, um, mostly poverty, mostly welfare. You wouldn't think that one day I'd become a filmmaker. In fact, when I grew up, mostly what Native kids were encouraged to be nurses for girls. Nothing, that's a beautiful, beautiful profession. I know that's something I couldn't undertake. I don't like nurses are angels, and or welding. My brother became a welder, and so there was a kind of very limited scope by which you could kind of see your future. It's changed a lot. Now we see Indigenous people with, the doctors and, astronauts and, people just taking on the world. But when I grew up, which really wasn't that long ago, we weren't really encouraged. But I had this kind of, I actually had obsession with film. I was actually, I think, because I was kind of the middle kid, I was very introverted. I liked to watch films, and in those days it was mostly older films on television, and I'd watch them with my mom, and my mom would always engage with them, and she would always have these just sort of, it's funny, she'd say, "Oh well, if I made that film, I would do this,"
Hmm.
and actually, interesting enough, and back in the day, the CBC also ran a lot of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation would run a lot of foreign films. So, you'd see films from around the world that you wouldn't normally see, you would think growing up. So I did have this kind of thing, but again, never thought I'd be a filmmaker. I wanted to be a ballerina, which was again like so far-fetched. My mom told me, "Oh no, you can't become a ballerina because they have to have their lower ribs removed so they can be really, really thin."
Mm.
It's like that really scared me. And of course, we could never afford for me to go to ballet school anyway, so that was kind of out. But I like to tell this one story, and the story is of we would have always these kind of dramas would happen in our family, and the dramas were for many reasons. But anyways, one particular drama, we ended up in a motel out in the outside of this town along the highway, and we had to get out wherever it is that we were. We had to get out. So we got out, threw a bunch of stuff in bags, and I don't know how we got there. Maybe a cab. There was a blizzard. I don't know how the blizzard, how we got out into the out there in the blizzard, but we got there, and then I mean, I'm probably as a kid, I'm exaggerating. It was probably snowfall, but it felt like a blizzard added to the drama, I guess, of the scene. So anyways, at some point, my mom goes out, I guess, to find groceries. My older brothers and sisters take off because they're going to go hang out, find their friends, find a bus so they can go back into town to hang out with their friends. So I was left at the motel with my younger brothers and sisters. There was 8 of us in the family. So, anyways, I'm watching TV, and there was a black and white horror movie on. I think it's Nosferatu, but I don't know. Again, like I say, they would put weird movies on back in the day on CBC, but it could just be in any old horror movie. But whatever it was very frightening and scary to me. And you know, how you get as a kid, you get so frightened you can't move, like you literally can't move. So I'm on the couch and I can't move. And suddenly there was a thump, like a loud thump, and I guess that kind of broke me out of my fear. So I kind of threw back the curtain and I looked out, and the snow had stopped, and I guess the thump had been snow from the roof falling onto the snow below. And so the snow had stopped and the moon had come out, and out in the little field outside the motel there was a tree, and the tree, the moon was casting a shadow of the tree, and it reflected in the window. And in a strange childish way, in my mind it was like, oh, it's just all fake. It's not real. It's just shadow and light. It's just, it's nothing to fear. And so somehow that kind of stuck with me, I guess, that I started to, in some um, kind of, weird way, it became kind of, oh, I understood something about film even before I knew anything about film. So that's kind of stayed with me. And but you never would think that that would then still lead me to be a filmmaker. But flash forward, I ran away from home when I was 13. I lived on the streets. I'd like to say I live on the streets and not off the streets, which I know that's a distinction I don't make to embarrass those people who had to live off the street. But somehow I was able to like sleep in Stanley Park because I ran away from Alberta to Vancouver, and I would sleep in Stanley Park and so on, and eventually became a mother, a very young teenage mother. So then I had to change my whole life and get organized and get mature and grown up, and so I could take care of her. And I especially didn't want um, welfare coming in and taking her, because that's the experience also of Native families till to this day in Canada, is taking kids away, putting them in foster care. We only represent, or I don't know, some depending on the statistics you want to use, 5 to 7 to 8% of the population, but our foster care, we represent about 50 to even 60% in foster care in Canada. So, anyways, I didn't want this, so I went to work, and I was lucky enough because I eventually got a summer job because I also went back to school at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And the Union of BC Indian Chiefs was a political organization still today. It's probably one of the more radical, which I embrace that word with enthusiasm, because it stood for sovereignty, it stood for Indigenous rights, and they had this huge library, and they had films in there, and many of those films were about Indigenous stories, Indigenous experiences, and we would have these lunch times where we would watch those films, and we would talk about them. And then also I worked for the government then also as sort of a summer student project. And I remember saying, well, instead of me writing a report, why don't I get a video camera and go out and record and make videos about the work that these summer students are doing? Because I was the coordinator of these summer students. And I could show the work rather than just put words on paper. And so I already had this kind of inclination that image and can maybe speak to people in ways that we normally don't associate with um, sharing of particular knowledge, like summer students doing particular projects and so on. And so I don't know, at some point I decided, hey, I want to go to film school. And, I was a single mom, I was working full time. Like, how am I possibly going to go to film school? But my managers knew I was like a workaholic. So they agreed to let me work full time. And I applied to film school and I got in. And so I was able to go to film school. I didn't take all the other university courses that would go for first year university, but I took the film courses, which was, art history, film production, and film history. And so those were all things that and I kept working. And then in second year, I decided, okay, I just want to dedicate myself to this. So I'll just work part time. And that kind of began my journey into making film. So it was kind of like I saw that there were different ways to tell our story as Indigenous people, and that the stories told through film, told through, moving image was just as powerful and in some ways more powerful than those, reports that, were written about us, or even if sometimes they're written by us. So that became one of my kind of ways I went into film.
Wow. I mean, even as I want to first thank you for vulnerably sharing, your life story. I think one of the most beautiful things I really enjoy about these conversations is sometimes you get to take your shoes off and really just step into the shoes of another person to kind of for a brief second just be like, what would it have been like, to for somebody else to have perceived and understood the world in such a way that it led them to where they are today. One question I have for you, touching back on what you just kind of ended there with, is why film? What is it perhaps that's different about film that about narrating an experience rather than poetry or writing a novel or through just photography? What is it unique about film, do you think?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think because I also write, right? So I write scripts. So I do I think sometimes I really am more like a frustrated artist, like seeing that image in my mind and seeing that story in my mind, and wanting to be able to take that paintbrush or that line and somehow draw that out. Um, Became like a whole other trajectory. I mean, some people are just naturally artists. I have a brother who's naturally an artist, and sister that can just draw and paint and make anything. But for me, I thought, oh, I was a little intimidated by that. Although I think I have that eye and that hand-eye coordination to do, probably not bad art. But it also meant to me, oh, I probably have to go to art school, and here I am at film school. But I think yeah, I think it does speak to those things that conjure up in my mind and trying to find some life for them outside of my mind. It could be poetry, it could be novel, but because it's visual, it makes sense for me to be either art or film. So I think that's part of it. And then there's a weird sensation that happens when I'm actually making films. Um, when you're actually on set and you've done all the work producing and getting everything ready, and you have this great crew and you have this great group of people behind and in front of the camera, you almost time suspends. Your past, present, and future all become one. Because as a filmmaker, you're always thinking about the next shot. You're always thinking, well, how am I going to edit this? Because if you're doing documentaries, sometimes you don't know, it's unpredictable. Things will happen that, even the best laid plans, you can't, it's going to change. So you have to always be thinking, how am I going to make this work? What image will I need to go with this? What sound will I need to go with this? What kind of editing? What kind of music? But also because I've done all the preparation, because I've immersed myself in the story, that is also coexisting with, so those plans, those ideas, everything else coexisting with that present, and then also with that future. And it kind of feels, like I say, kind of a timelessness. You're almost in
Mm,
a cocoon. You're living for that moment. You're living for that place. You're living for that interaction with all those people. And so it's a very, I don't know. So I don't know. It's hard to say. It's a very, I guess some people who were Buddhists would say maybe it's a kind of a Zen thing. But maybe artists would say it's just you're in the muse. It's working through
mm,
you. Um, but it's just it takes on its own energy, and it's a beautiful thing. I mean, even when problems happen, you still find ways to kind of deal with that problem. So yeah, I think that's it. I think it was just, I don't know, it's just something that just I felt like that was the place where I would be most welcome. Although it hasn't been easy, I wasn't always most welcome. I had a lot of struggles as uh, a young Native woman filmmaker back in the day. It was never like, um, there was many obstacles. I mean, many times I was told, "Oh, the only reason you're here is because you're Native. They're just letting you do this because you're Native." Um, not because I went to film school, not because I had this lived experience, not because, I was a determined person and, focused person and a visual person and a storytelling person. No, because you just, they're giving you some kind of, well, didn't call it that back in those days, but DEI, right? That's, you're just there because, we lent you be here, So,
mm,
so it was never easy. But yeah, no, it's a beautiful thing. Plus, you get to spend time. In the early days, I did mostly documentaries, and I got to spend time with so many beautiful people that I would otherwise probably never met. And because I'm an introvert, I think it's a little harder for me to go up and just show up, you know. And maybe I feel like I
mm.
have to show up with a purpose. I have to show up with a reason or with a gift or with, an offering of some sort, which is. And then I also think I was again go back to the BC Indian chiefs when I worked there. I was very fortunate to be around many of the elders that are long gone, who just had um, such presence and could make everything they said into a story. And with those stories came images. And those images just started to kind of live in my imagination. And then I thought, well, you know, they need to come out in some ways. So I feel very, very, very privileged and honored that was able to have that experience and still do. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's also, it reaches different audiences. It reaches, it goes beyond, you would like to think anyways. It can take us into different communities, different people, different experiences. They can come and see your work and,
100%.
perhaps find something new that they didn't know before.
It's a wonderful way to learn about the world and people who look different than you without actually having to be there. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about watching movies from different cultures. Because for most people, it's, I mean, really difficult to actually go live it's impossible to go understand and live with every culture, but you can watch their films to then better understand what their day to day is like or what are the problems and challenges that they're dealing with. One question I have for you is you talked a little bit about using film as a medium through which you can kind of tell this story. I'm curious what is that story? What are some of the things that you're trying to highlight through your film?
Um, well, there's a couple of things. I think I remember one thing my dad, well, actually, my mom told me this. I don't remember my dad saying this, but he always used to say there's no justice in the world. And,
Hmm.
when I thought about that, thinking about his life, his struggles, he was an alcoholic who tried really hard to work hard for his family. He was he worked in the oil fields in Alberta and worked up north in the bush. He helped make Alaska Highway, which was, not an easy thing to do. Um, he so he saw a lot of injustice. He lived a lot of injustice. Our family lost our and homelands many times, and so eventually we end up in the city, not by our choice, but because there was no place else to go. So I remember he was one of those guys that would give anybody anything they needed. Even though we had so little. But so that's some one thing. I think one of the things is that I'd like to think that I'm doing this to show Dad that there we there can be justice, that we can restore um, the good in the world. We can make things right, and even if the film isn't going to change the world, the people who you honor in the film who are trying to change the world, at least you can share that message to the world, and you can make the film in such a way that you can give people hope, and leading to that justice. I think that it's that. I think also because growing up and in Canada you have the National Film Board, and in school, particularly when we lived in the city, they showed a lot of National Film Board films, and I wouldn't be where I am today without National Film Board because the first films I made were through the National Film Board. So, I have only gratitude for them. But those early films that they were showing us, and they were often older films already, we were basically portrayed as subjects. It's like ethnography of some sort, or we were looked at. We were looked from the outside in at us.
Hmm.
Even though the National Film Board was trying, I guess, to try to portray us as uh, still vital parts of Canada, there still was a sense of the loss, that the Native story is really about loss and grief, in the end, the end is near kind of thing. So those were very, very discouraging for me as a kid, sitting in those dark classrooms looking at these films where, I'd see white kids snickering at us, not paying attention, and not really caring. Of course, they showed other films too, but I mean, when they showed a Native film, there was always a bit of dread on my part because I thought, oh, what's the what's the feedback that's going to happen in the room because of this? Is there going to be any sensitivity to our story and to who we are? So I think that was another reason, was to counter that, to counter, as a kid, when you went to school, because we were often on welfare, we were the kids that were kind of, with the welfare kids, please stay after school, because we would get vouchers for our school books, or we'd get vouchers for something or other. So all of us, and there was white kids too, and mostly in Alberta, there was a very small, there was some black communities and like rural farming communities, but there was really very few black families at the time, very few Asian families at the time. Lebanese families were growing in Edmonton where we were growing up, but mostly it was like immigrants and white people who had been there for a few generations. So, um, that, I guess that was the other thing, is I don't know where I was going with that one, but I mean, I guess there was just, not a lot of knowledge of who we were. And there was always so many entrenched prejudice. So that was another reason, is to try to tell stories beyond the ones that, and we also, like I say, you also have this kind of feeling, you know, I mean, I don't think it ever actually happened to me, but I heard these stories of, they check your hair for lice kind of thing, because Native kids got lice. So there was that feeling of being inspected all the time. And so I wanted to do the camera where it's not inspecting us. I wanted the camera not to be like a tour guide of Native people. I wanted the camera to be, showing our agency. Um, you know, Me exercising my agency as a storyteller, as a Native woman, but also making sure that the people who are participating in the making of my film, from the behind the scenes and in front of the screen, um, in front of the camera, are all have their own agencies and recognized for their agency, and that
Hmm.
becomes part of the kind of the environment in which the film is made. So I think those were all other reasons for me to pursue film. And I was lucky because living in Vancouver, as I became an adult, um, the Vancouver Film Festival brought a lot of particularly Asian films from Japan and Korea and China, and so I got to see a lot of foreign films or Russian films or anything. I would go and see any film from any part of the world, just so I could experience how other people, portrayed themselves, portrayed their stories. And I really wanted to be part of that. I really wanted to be part of that kind of deconstructing of the way we had been portrayed in Canada. And there's a whole other
Hmm.
thing. There's Hollywood, and there's westerns and cowboys and Indians, and there's all that. I mean, I was partly influenced by that because, of course, you know, that was still on television, you know, those John Wayne westerns and so on. But really, I was more influenced by that ethnographic gaze, that social worker gaze, that kind of shaming gaze that I felt from, you know, the mainstream Canada and from mainstream Canadian media.
Wow. I mean, I think there was so much beauty and depth in what you said that I'm like, I need to listen back to this podcast to kind of, let it sit in
Uh-oh.
again. But, I want to kind of talk a little bit about a point you made there, which is, reframing the way we perceive a group. I mean, I think this you talked about ethnographic gaze and wanting to show the agency rather than always being the victimized group. My question for you is for an aspiring filmmaker, or not even a filmmaker, but let's say I'm someone who travels and works with different communities and I want to share the story. When the only way we've seen stories told about certain groups is through that kind of ethnographic gaze, how do you break out of that system of thinking to then like be like, this is how you show someone having agency? Uh, what did it take to kind of reframe that and think of something completely new for yourself?
Well, I think, well, in making films, every film I've made, I've always asked the people who are going to be in the film, what kind of film do you want me to make? Like, what's the message? What's the story that you want to carry forward? And every one of them, without me prompting, I've always used the word hope. They've always said
Mm,
they want to give the next generation and future generations hope. That they want everybody to feel, because a lot of my films in the early days were with older people, with elders and veterans and so on. And so they had been through it all. And yet they had never given up. None of them had ever given up. And so they wanted to, you know, let people know that they've never given up and that there's hope. And so that was always important to me, that I didn't want to do trauma porn. Even before those terms were used, trauma porn, I always knew I didn't want to re-traumatize our people. Um, you know, I myself, I never went to residential school, but we were apprehended at some point in our lives, and we ended up in a place where they would put non-status Indians and off reserve, or you know, mixed breeds or Métis, and there was some white kids in there too. But I was in a place like that once, and I witnessed a lot of trauma and experienced some trauma. I mean, I was very young, so I didn't stay there very long. My sister stayed longer, and my brother stayed in another place, and that was pretty apparently very traumatic for one of my brothers who still struggles with that. So I didn't want to re-traumatize our people. I mean, and I didn't want to sensationalize. I wanted to make sure that I wanted it to make sure it felt like, you know, you were sitting with your aunties and uncles, you were sitting with your family, and you know, you were comfortable and safe in that place, and then you could tell your story. And to me, that was important for me to make, including like the environment I created within which the story would be told. There's this great thing I learned when I went to film school, um, and it was actually told to me by another film student who has since passed away, which is so sad. He was a young guy. But anyways, there was a French Canadian filmmaker, a Quebecois filmmaker, who came to our film school before I was there. And he had talked about how when he makes a film, he would gather all his crew and they would have a big feast. And he would tell them that when they're making a film, they are creating a circle. In that circle, everybody's equal. The production assistant to the director are all equal. Because if a PA or a director makes a mistake, it's going to affect everybody. So everybody's equal in that circle. And what they do is they serve the story. They serve either the people in the documentary or the actors, or you know, whatever the story is, they're there to serve the story. And I remember hearing that, and it so resonated with me because I thought, well, that actually sounds very native. because I was taught that um, um, that as adults, our role is to create a circle, so that at the center of the circle, the youth and the elders and the children can be safe, so that the elders can pass on the knowledge to the children and the youth. And we're there to give them that protection and the resources and the safety and the comfort to be able to do that. That in a way, that's our job, that's our role. And I thought that was what he said was so similar. So whenever I made films, I would tell that to my crew, that that's what we're here to do. We're creating a sacred space around this story, around these people, and we're here to serve them. And that's how I think you try to create those kind of organic um, kind of experiences where everything is authentic and real and kind of comes out of that, rather than trying to impose this. Well, you got to tell the story this way, you got to tell the story that way. We got to have the trauma, we got to have the pain and suffering, we got to see all that. I think if you come at it from that perspective, you can still deal with the hard truths, you can still deal with the pain, you can still deal with the genocide, but you can do it in a way with that message of hope. And that's kind of what
Hmm.
try to approach. And I hear a dog barking. So
Yeah, I mean, I really hear you talking about this tenderness in which sometimes these topics have to be approached so you don't continuously re-victimize the people who are involved in any of these projects. I mean, I think this concept of hope is, yeah, there's a movie called Children of Men. I don't know if you've seen that.
yeah,
I
yeah,
love, yeah, I love that
yeah,
movie. I think it does a phenomenal job of highlighting the value of hope and
yeah,
how when hope is lost, everything in a lot
yeah,
of ways is lost.
yeah.
And so I guess my question for you is from a narrative perspective, how do you what is the minute details that shifts a story from being trauma porn into something that someone may leave feeling hopeful? I feel like it's actually really slight. They're not very large differences. How do you kind of so you said earlier about kind of the intention in which you create the space and how you kind of go about even thinking about what the message is. But are there particular stylistic things that you do differently when you want your message to be about hope?
Well, I mean, I guess it's a few things, because when you think about it, I remember there's a great native Maori filmmaker who was also a philosopher, theorist. It's gone now, Barry Barkley. And Barry Barkley wrote about how what happens when we take our, well, he would use many Maori terms for this. We take our story, our lives, our lived experience to the marketplace, because you can't deny it. That's what we're doing, right? I still have to go get government funding. I still have to, go to a broadcaster. I have to, convince the people that there's an audience for this. In other words, the market. And so how do I um, so at the core, there's a lot of capitalism. And what is capitalism like? Fear and pain and all those things that sensationalize, all those things that make, they think, when we see it writ large now, create, audience or likes, or, whatever it is that this the way that, this culture has kind of gone. But even just from a film perspective, how do I bring forward, because I have to sell these stories, I have to sell these concepts, I have to convince people to support the project. If I just said, oh, I just want to do hope and I just want to do nice things, they'd probably go, oh, ho hum, what are we doing? So one of the things I try to think about is um I try to think about what shared experience might we have. So when I made one of my first films called The Learning Path, and it was about, not so much about residential school per se, but it was about Indigenous women who had made change within the educational system. And all of them had gone through residential school. Two of them had had really bad experiences there. One of them, was sort of a neutral experience. But nonetheless, they were still experiences of you know, the intention of residential schools was genocide, right? Basically assimilation, kill the Indian and save the man. That was, kind of the concept. So I sort of think, well, is there anything? I would think that if the audience isn't native, and a lot of times, particularly in Canada, we still have residential school denier to say, oh, they weren't so bad. There's politicians that are in our government right now who still hold that view. Um, so, um, so, is there a place by which we meet, not just in exploitation of our trauma and our pain, but is there any shared sense that I can portray as a filmmaker? We've all been lonely. We've all been hurt. We've all felt displaced in some form or another. What visuals, what music, what things that can I do as a filmmaker to help bring those things to bear to penetrate those uh, non-believers, if you like, or those people who are resistant to our story, or so that there's a kind of a commonality. And to go back to the learning path, um, you know, I had to make that film. We shot in 16 mil back in the day, and I was basically hired on November 1st, and we started shooting like January like second or third, and the coldest winter had been in Edmonton for ages. So I I had to go fast, and I'm known as this expressionistic, poetic filmmaker. Partly because I don't think I really ever knew how to make a proper National Film Board Canadian, Gerson kind of, documentary. So I was just winging it, with all my hopefully cultural teachings kind of being there and my artistic vision and so on. But one of the things happened was we went into an old residential school, an abandoned old residential school. And I had these, we didn't have much of a budget. And so our dolly was basically, some kind of mobile cart of some sort where I put the cameraman on. And we went through these old bathrooms and old things that were just, you know, um, abandoned. I opened the cabinet doors up above and just see the sort of stark edges of, and, empty sort of dark closets and these old um, sinks and stuff, and imagining all these little kids that had to go in there and all wash their hands, and all kinds of horrific things were happening once they went back to the bedroom, to their beds and stuff, and all like sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. It was all everything. So I thought, but if I have these moments of reflection in that film, if I have these moments of loneliness, of sadness, of isolation, maybe it can penetrate, and those people who aren't native, who haven't been to those places, but who have felt that can sort of you know resonate with that. And then on top of that, when I showed the film with some elders in Minnesota at one time, I remember one lady coming to me and she said, "How did you know? How did you know?" And I said, "What do you mean? How did you know?" She says, "Well, when I was being, you know, essayed, I don't know whether you can say those things on your channel, but when I was experiencing those, horrific things, she said, I would leave my body and I would go up into the pipes or I would go into the sink. And that's where I would put my soul. And then let those things happen to me. And then when it was over, I would come back." And so those spaces that I created in that film represented to her those moments when she was basically out of her body while those things were happening. So on one hand, it kind of represented that horror, that trauma that I could have turned into trauma porn. But to her, it was more it was the moment. It was that moment she was escaping. Why would she want to relive that
Hmm.
experience? It was that moment she was escaping, and this is how she experienced it. And then at the same time, those non-Indigenous people who'd never experienced what we experienced had still that moment of loneliness and
Hmm.
solitude, and perhaps could find some common ground there.
It's to connect the viewer with some element of shared experience so that when they watch it, you're not so othered. It's not just like, okay, I'm watching this other group of people who have their own problems and I just want to come learn about it, rather than,
Yeah.
I don't know, feeling the humanity that connects us all and understanding it from that perspective, which is like, this could have also been me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I mean, it's not, we're not the only ones, education has been used as a tool of tyranny, around the world by colonizers and, imperialists, forever, and we see it creeping in again, and so so there it could yeah, so those are some of the
Mhm.
things I get.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I'm curious, being Indigenous yourself, how do you feel like what are some of the largest traits of Indigenous storytelling, and how do you feel like those understandings impacted the way you approach film?
Well, that sacred circle is one, but it's funny. I've always kind of I've grappled with this. Is there an Indigenous aesthetic? Because first of all, I don't know. There's 600 Indigenous nations in Canada, and I probably there's many in the States as well. And there's like 462 million Indigenous people around the world speaking 40,000, no, 4,000 different languages. So, there can't possibly be one aesthetic, and, representing. And very much aesthetic and language come out of place, come out of land, come out of, your own lived experience. And so, um, but I've grappled with this because I remember reading an essay, and I can see it's Dwayne, trying to Daune. I'm trying to remember his last name. He's a poet in Washington State and Indigenous poet. And he was asked that question about poetry: Is there an Indigenous poetic, aesthetic? And he said, no. You can't tell anybody. This is the way you have to make your poem. This is the way you have to. Everybody's individual, and everybody has their own way of saying things. Um, and yet at the same time, I've also often looked at, well, what kind of templates do Indigenous artists use to tell their stories? Like the beadwork, the fact that the Métis flowers are five, whereas the Cree flowers are four. Um, and that, but in either one, in both of them, there's always one single bead that's different color from all the other beads to show that, uh, it can't be perfect because only nature is perfect. And so, um, so, and then there's, the West Coast people, they have their own form line and U shapes. They have their own design forms that, kind of play with negative and positive spaces. And, where I come from, there's a kind of a woodland style of art, which is, where like Navarro is like I guess the most famous of artists who brought this forward, where you see these figures and you see the inside of the moose or the bear or whatever, and there's lines connecting that moose to that bear to that human to that sky to that, so everything is kind of there's energy, lines that sort of coexist between, all these beings. So how do you represent that? And then there's also, things like light and shadow, because after all, it's all light and shadow, right? And so light and shadow is, when I used to teach, I would talk to the students and say, well, what's your experience with light? Like, what's the first time you remember light? Like, was it the sun? Was it, a stark light bulb above you, in a, um, some SRO kind of, rooming house somewhere, was it being out watching the sunset? What was your relationship to light? Um, what was your relationship to shadow? You know, how did you experience the dappling of poplar leaves? Like that was my thing because growing up in the prairies, those poplar or birch leaves, that dappling, it happens, and when you sit on, when they kind of like create these sort of rippling kind of beautiful patterns in shadows in the sun as the breeze blows. Like all those things are kind of like how do they influence the choices I make as a storyteller? one of the things I also really wanted to do was show the epicness of our bodies, because
Mm,
often our bodies are, the site of genocide, right? From all kinds of, in Canada, as in the States, the one drop of black blood in Canada, in the States, they try to get rid of us as soon as they can. So when a Native woman marries a non-status Native man, she would lose her status. All her kids would lose their status. They couldn't live on the reserve anymore. So their whole plan was just to basically get rid of us by any means possible, because they wanted our land, right? And um, but I always thought, regardless of our skin tone, or regardless, but we were epic people. We had epic scale. We were epic. And so that was also important, how I choose to light our bodies, how I choose to
mm,
position our bodies. Do I position our bodies like full on the landscape, with the sky above, and, or with the sky, and, people framed against the sky, or so it was really important to me. I
mm,
remember one producer saying to me once, because I would often frame full scale, because that was important for me. People see our full bodies on the land. And so I remember a producer saying to me once, "Oh, when I saw your film and you had all these wide shots of the people on their bodies on the land, and sitting and telling their stories, I thought, well, she doesn't really know how to make films." And then I realized that actually you were doing that on purpose. And I says, "Yeah, because we're epic people, and I want us, depth of field has always been important, and I'm lucky that's one of the I think it was really important to me as a filmmaker going to art school, film school, was learning about depth of field, and how critical that is in terms also of positioning you within space, within a place. So, I guess those are all things that come to play when I choose, with respect to an aesthetic. But I could never impose that. What I tried to do, like when I used to teach, I would try to encourage people to find out their relationship to those things, to light and shadow, to place, to their physicality, to color. I even had once, I remember reading and studying a Japanese artist, filmmaker, I think in the 60s. And he had taken all the color green out of his films because he felt that Japanese culture at that time had lost its relationship to nature, because it was going through that
mm,
vast industrialization and after the war. And so he took green out of all his pictures because he felt that the Japanese people no longer deserved the color green, because of they had lost that relationship to nature. So, I asked the students the same thing. What's your relationship to this color? Obviously, red, is an important color because we're called redskins, even though that was a derogatory racist term, because that was referencing scalping us, and people getting paid to get those sculpts. But but um, but every culture has a different relationship to color. So red and black and white and blue and yellow, not all have a ceremonial purpose, have ceremonial meaning. And those meanings, relate to ceremony, relate to spiritual relationships to nature, and and metaphysical relationships. So you're making film, you're working with color. What's your relationship to color as well? What's your
mm,
relationship to pacing? Do you like to fast edits, go fast, 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 or do you like long, lingering, moments where things just seem to become dreamlike? So
mm,
those are all things that I'd like to think it's up to the filmmaker to find that place, but drawing from, and even I say, even if you never grew up, you know, that connected to your culture, even because so many kids grew up in the city or grew up in foster homes or adopted, and even if you didn't have one, what was that relationship? Because that's important too. Maybe it was neon lights, reflected in, the rainy streets. Maybe that's your aesthetic because that's how you grew up. That's what light and shadow is to you. Like, it's just that I think the important thing about Indigenous aesthetic is owning your vision, owning your eye, owning where that comes from, and understanding where it comes from, not just because this is the way Native people have been portrayed. This is what the market expects to see us and suffering and seeing us, in pain. Um, if you what does it mean when you draw from the stories or the experiences of your pain, even when you're telling the story of somebody else's pain? How does that? And then ultimately, story is supposed to heal. I mean, stories are part of healing. And so that's another part of the aesthetic. What is it that I imbue the story with and the visuals and the music that's going to help lead to that, even a glimpse of healing?
Mhm. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I want to make a movie myself now. Like, no, I'm feeling quite inspired, and I think if I was to extract a lot of what you're saying, I feel like when I think back to the way history was taught for me and how this kind of whom you look at history through, like the lens in which you understand. Are you looking at someone else? Are you looking at people like you? Completely change your reading of that particular history. And I think a lot of what you're saying, to tie it back to education in some ways, I think by developing this critical lens of, okay, what is the perspective through which I'm even understanding, or is this history spoken about, can give you that okay, perhaps maybe this isn't the best way to maybe understand what they're going through rather than just looking at it from an outside perspective. And I think so much of what you said this conversation is offering insight and things that you can pay attention to when you are either reading a book about a group of people or watching a film. So I want to say thank you so much for all your insights and I am, I mean, just for the sake of curiosity, what's been your favorite film that you've made so far?
Well, I'm just wondering, are we going to have time to talk about some of the educational projects I'm doing too? Is that the next part, or are we going to kind of wrap up with the film part?
No, I'd love to know. I didn't know how much
Okay,
time you
because
had left. Yeah.
because I created the I'm4 Lab to train Indigenous people in XR,
Yeah, so tell me about that. I'd
and
love to
and
know.
then I also so okay, so it's hard for me to so of course, probably, I mean, every film is, I think my Monkey Beach was probably the film that was the most struggle for me. And
Hmm.
it's a still struggle because I didn't have a very good working relationship with my non-native 49% co-producing partners. Because in Canada, we don't have a lot of net worth, even though I own this dumpy little, you know, um, duplex um, in a small town called Gibsons. But um, that so now I have some net worth according to the banks. But the way the funding works in Canada, even people think we got so much funding up that works up here. What you have to do is you have to get a lot of your budget comes from tax credits. So
Hmm.
basically, your labor, whatever labor you pay out, um, you are then able to claim a tax credit against that. So you need, for my, I need maybe 300,000, $400,000 in an interim bank loan from the bank to cover that part of my budget that will come back to me from the government as tax credits.
Hmm.
So in addition to having to pay the bank, their bank fees and interest and lawyer fees and so on, um, I have to, you know, borrow that money. And so when you make a bigger film like Monkey Beach, which was a feature film, and you're looking at, in that case, it was about a $3 million budget. Well, two point whatever, 2 point whatever. They started off at 2.5, but the actual part of it, anyways, money doesn't matter. It was low budget. I didn't have the money. I didn't have the net worth according to the banks to get the amount of money I needed for the tax credit. So I had to go partner with non-native co-producers. I'm grateful. I wouldn't have been able to do that otherwise. But because of that colonial legacy, and I know there's some good non-native co-producing partners out there who work well with their native partners, but somehow there was this perception that even though they were the 49%, because they were the knowledgeable ones and they were putting in the tax credits, they were carrying the tax credits at the bank, and so they had to manage the budget, that my 51% ownership meant nothing. I had no rights, I had no authority, I had no voice. So it was a struggle. It was a systemic issue. I'm sure they in their hearts don't feel themselves to be racist, but it was a systemic issue. So it's really hard for me because it was a heartbreak, because that film, it took me 15 years to make. I'm always ahead of the curve. I was trying to make that film way back in the early aughts, like 2002, 2003, and there was really no other native. We were trying to do it as native producer, native director, native writer, do all native crew, and of course everybody just rolled their eyes at us. Um, and so it took a long time, took a really long time, and so I'm grateful it got made. But it still breaks my heart that it wasn't really the film, uh, as much of the film as I wish it could have been, because of those struggles, those daily struggles dealing with that inequity and that stuff. So I'm not afraid to say it. Um, but that's a whole other story. But
Hmm.
nonetheless, I'm happy that I did the things that I did do, and this is why I'm really happy about it. It took me that one of the reasons it took me that long to make that film because I wanted the film to be made where the story was written, the story where it was conceived. It was basically written by Eden Robinson, who's a Hulsuk woman. Her village where she grew up was Kitimat, which is like a 18-20 hour drive from Vancouver. And that's where you have to be. So it was really important for me to there because one of the principles I try to work by is redistribution of wealth. So it was important for me as little as I got out of it, because I that's a whole other story. Um, it was important for me to redistribution of wealth, that we bring that benefit back to the village. And so the film was made in that village.
Hmm.
And I was able to hire a lot of crew, a lot of the fishing boats that no longer get to be, as fiscally, you know, profitable as they used to be when there were fish. So
Hmm.
there's but these beautiful fishing boats that, and all these people from the village who have a lot of knowledge of the channel and the waters, and that, were critical to being filming on those waters. Things like that. That was what makes me feel best about it. The fact that we went there and we did our best to serve the community, to serve the place, to serve that. It's funny because there, yeah. So that's a whole other story. We could do another podcast on that and talk about the story itself. But I
Yeah.
think one of the things that two of the things I love all my films. I love Forgotten Warriors. I loved working with the veterans. I loved working in Hands of History with the woman artist. I love working with the films of the people. Every film I've loved all the people I've been able to work with. So that's the best thing. And I think 99, I think actually 100% of the time, the people whose story I'm telling are happy. And that's also the more important to me than anything, is that they're
Hmm.
happy, that they feel like I've done something right. I did a film with the people called The People Go On, with the Kainai people, the Blackfoot people in Southern Alberta. And we showed it at the Calgary Film Festival. And one of the counselors came up, chief of council, one of the council came up and he watched the film and he got up at the end and he said, there's so many films made about Blackfoot people. And he says, every one of them, when it's over, I always feel despair, like, we're disappearing, that, there's no future for us. But he said, this is the first film I've seen where I feel hope. I feel hope. I feel like, I feel good about myself, and
Hmm.
so, they're all important films. I really, really like doing Coyote Science, though, in my children's series. I think those are the things that, on a very kind of personal level, I think those are the ones I feel really good about because for one thing, I've been doing all these films and winning all these awards. I probably won more than 20 awards was for Monkey Beach alone. Like it's probably 25 now. But my other projects, my documentaries, won some awards here and there. But but I couldn't, you know, I went looking for work. I couldn't even get work on reality TV because, what do I know? Even though I've been in film school and I made all these films. So I had to become my own producer. And one of the things I knew that we weren't visible. Our kids weren't visible on the screens. And, doing research about educational media is that whenever people see themselves in curriculum, when they see themselves on screens, when they see their experiences being portrayed, it makes them feel good about themselves, so and they do better at school when they see, and for me it's not just that they're being told, oh, you're great. It's like this is something that belongs to them and they can share with their family and they can share with their friends and their non-indigenous friends and say, hey, this is us. This is who I am. I feel good about you. Like come in and see a little bit about who we are, and it's something they can share with their friends. and share with their schools. And and it's not the kind of the dire, terrible, cringe-worthy ethnography that normally would often be portrayed. It was something fun. It's something I always have hip hop that drives all my children's series. Um, you know, hip hop has been a big thing in Indian country, from kids to elders. When Tribe Called Red was around, they've broken up now, but when they were around, it wasn't just the hipsters that were going to Tribe Called Red. It was like the elders were going, and it was all ages, and the kids would go. Everybody went, and so those are the things that kind of excite me because again, it was. And the other thing that really made what was drove me in making those series was again bringing a native crew. Like I'm still being told I'm still being after all the films I made and going to film school. I'm still being told, oh, you need more training, or you're not experienced enough, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. So and oh, there's no native crews. Well, I found native crews. I was working with native crews from way back, in the early aughts, and people who maybe never directed before, but who had maybe directed theater or who had acted, but who I know to be very organized and who I could trust with kids. I hired them as directors, and they became some of the best directors. So um, those are the things that I'm really proud of because I feel like I had the kind of control of those to kind of implement those belief systems, those values that I try to honor and try to grow up with, grew up with, and and then that was the first one was Nahiwa, which is teaching kids, kind of introducing them to the first uh, kind of the words you might learn of your language, in this case, Niawa or Cree. So it was like colors and counting, and the kids were like 5 and 6, and we go and go out and have fun. And so it wasn't just about learning your language, but it was learning your language in a place. So we live in the city, a city far from our territory, but we can still learn our language. We can still speak our language, so we can be running and dancing and so on, and we can learn the words for running and dancing. We can have a powwow and learn the words for powwow, and all we can go rock climbing. We can go to Science World. We can play soccer. All the things, we can go to the haunted house for the Halloween episode. All the things that kids like to do, but they can do in their language, and so that was sort of I feel really proud of that. Um, and then I went on to do Coyote Science, which is a series about Indigenous science. And I was very, very proud of that because I'd always, but back in the day, I met these wonderful people called Dr. Leroy Little Bear, who you should have on your series.
Mm.
His wife Amethyst, first writer, and they're Blackfoot. And Leroy has always been a big proponent of Indigenous science. So even though he was a lawyer and his background is law, he said if he hadn't gone into law, he was going to go into science. And he always saw this connection between quantum physics and what he called Blackfoot science. So this idea of energy and the relationship to forces of in the universe and so on. He felt there was parallels to that and indigenous understandings of cosmology of everything that really is contained within quantum physics. So he had actually worked with a group of elders, and he had reached out to quantum physicists, Dr. Peel and Dr. Bohm, BOHM, who had passed away shortly after. And they were for 10 years, including at MIT, they would bring elders and physicists together, usually quantum physicists, to talk about those relationships. So I always wanted to go to them. I never got to go to any of them, but I was always inspired by that. And so I started to go deeper and deeper into looking at Indigenous science. What is it? What is it? I mean, how, do we have science? I mean, Western culture tells us, oh, no, 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 you don't have science because you don't have the scientific method. You don't test, you don't do double blinds, all those things you can't possibly have science. So, I was lucky. I read the book by Dr. Gregory Kahetti called Native Science. Was inspired by people also like Dr. Lorna Williams, who's a Lilwat educator, who has been one of my mentors for many, many years, who has also been advocating for Indigenous science in schools. And she actually wrote, before the book Braiding Sweetgrass came out, she wrote a book, I think, called Braiding Knowledge, and basically talking about how to integrate Indigenous science into curriculum. And so those were my influences to creating Indigenous science, a series about Indigenous science, using Coyote as a kind of principle of that, because within Coyote sort of represents, what Leroy talks about, how in the Indigenous way, the universe is chaos. And we try to bring balance and harmony to that chaos. And that's why we practice ceremony. That's why we do the things that we do. That's why we try to live in balance and harmony with the universe, with the environment. And Coyote kind of represents both knowledge but also chaos. So
Hmm.
so it was sort of that was the character that kind of drove the series. It was for grades 1, 2, 3, and we kind of go through there's riddles. Coyote gives a riddle, and then the kids go out and try to find out how to solve the riddle. They meet with elders. There was always a hack, sort of like a DIY experiment you could do at home. I was very fortunate to have Dr. John Harrington, who's also Commander John Harrington, who was a NASA astronaut, Chickasaw Nation, who actually walked in space. He was one of our regular guests who would come on and talk about parts of Indigenous science, like ancient Indigenous science. So I did that series for 3 seasons. We did, first season was all about the riddles and the chaos. The second season was about learning from place. Well, the first one was riddles, but really stories. The second was learning from place, because again, to go back to the principles of Indigenous science, one of them is all about observing, and one of them is about observing in place, like the environment in which you're in. And then the third one was technology. So we went
Hmm.
into Coyote's tech, and always had kids. That was the other thing that was really important for us, our kids. So it wouldn't be just some hosts showing off. We had a youth host. We had Coyote show up, but it was always driven by kids themselves. So our kids in every way they look, from fair skin to dark skin, people who were mixed. One of kids, her mother was uh, African American and Cree, and the girl's father was from Mali. There was another kid who was from my earlier series who was father was Vietnamese, his mother was Cree. So all the mixtures that are going on in Indian country, but we're still indigenous. And so it was important so that kids could see themselves reflected back from the screen and doing things that kids do, and having an almost kind of homemade feeling with that kind of, with a lot of motion graphics, a lot of art, a lot of energy. Um, I don't know. I'm just very proud of the template that I created, the style that I created. Sure, I was influenced a little bit by Sesame Street. I was
Hmm.
influenced by different educational ways. I did a lot of research. Um, but cognitive development, when kids learn what things and so on. But then I also applied Indigenous pedagogy for around learning, and try to create this very, so it's not telling kids what to think, not telling kids. It was really about getting kids to do and experience as a way of learning. So
Yeah.
I'm really, really proud of Coyote Science.
Yeah. I would love to. I think I will probably, I really want to watch um that one. And I had pulled it up. Give me a second. I really do want to watch Monkey Beach as well.
Did I share
Um
Monkey Beach with you?
no, but I found
Okay,
it
I'll share it with you. I'll send you my link so you can
yeah,
watch it.
I would love to
Yeah,
watch that.
I'd love you to, yeah, to watch it. So then you can see. So, but you know what I'm doing? I
Yeah.
don't, I don't know what the legal ramifications and the ethical ramifications are, but I'm going to work with one of the writers who's been really going into using AI, and not just like terrible things are being done
Yeah.
with AI right now with respect to film, but really using, basically manipulating AI
Hmm.
and taking maybe some scenes from Monkey Beach and trying to
Yeah.
realize them closer to what they were originally written and intended to be.
Oh, cool.
So we'll see if I can pull that off. I'm going to pull it off
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah,
Anyways, so
but
okay, so I've probably taken up a lot of your time, and I can go on, and I don't know how you're going to fit this all into your podcast, but you know,
No, I want to thank you so much, honestly, for sharing. And I think we were able to step into your world and understand as a filmmaker how you approach a lot of these things and how you approach storytelling. But I want to thank you so much for your time and your insights. And yeah, it was lovely speaking with you.
Yeah, it was lovely speaking with you. And I didn't, yeah, I guess in Cree is hi, thank you, or kin and most min, thank you. I'm grateful for you. I do appreciate this. I really looked at the work that you do, the podcast of the people you bring on. So I'm very honored to be here. So yeah, thank you so much. And if you need any more, just let me know and yeah, have fun with it. I don't know, I didn't give you many sound bites, but
No, you did. No, I
but
think I try to not approach it from a soundbite. I think to
yeah,
understand a person's ideas, you have to kind of sit with it. And I think
yeah.
there was so much beauty in all that you shared. So thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, and take care. And yeah, okay. Talk to you soon.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.